up here.
Hi, everybody.
Did you all have wine?
It's chilly in here.
Okay.
So I'll be super brief. First and foremost, my name is Graham Brookie. I'm the director of the Digital Forensic Research Lab here at the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for coming tonight. We set up the DFR Lab in order to do a few things. Most notably, identify, expose, and explain disinformation with an emphasis on explaining disinformation. The way by which we do that is open source research. So we publish a bunch of stuff using sources that don't say trust us because we're the DFR Lab and we're experts on this. We say don't trust us, look at the sources and how we came up with this, and then decide for yourself. And for us, that's a big part of solving the information war. Tonight, we're extremely pleased to have a distinguished fellow, Rick Stengel, here to talk about just that and his own experience with it. They're going to talk about their own personal experiences, so I will be extremely brief. Rick is uniquely situated to talk about this issue because for us, we think about this in terms of a collective challenge to, or a collective solution to a collective challenge. And for that, that's going to involve people from government, media, and tech. They all have roles to play. Rick is unique in the sense that he has had roles in all three of those things. Before joining government, he was the managing editor of Time. In government, he was the Undersecretary for Public Diplomacy and Public Affairs, how America communicates to the world, and now is on the board of Snap, which I said earlier, I admitted earlier that I don't use Snapchat as much as I probably should. So Rick has a unique vantage point into all of these things. He's written this book, Information Wars, how we lost the global battle for disinformation and what we can do about it. And it's not all bad news, I think. And we're extremely excited for Michelle, because she also has a unique vantage point in the sense that she has covered this from any number of places, to include the White House during the Obama administration, the State Department during the Trump administration. And so she's seen how government has grappled this and asked hard questions, and I know because we've had to answer hard questions, both Rick and I, from positions in government, about this issue. So both of you know this issue intimately. I will get out of your way. Housekeeping, Rick will be signing books after in the lobby, so make sure that you're comfortable, make sure that you have drinks, make sure that you have snacks, and we'll see you after. Thank you.
All right, welcome everyone. So if you haven't read the book, here it is, Information Wars, and it was a fantastic book. And I should admit, given the subject matter and the fact that I feel like I know a lot about it, I didn't quite expect it to be the hilarious page turner that it was. I laughed out loud many times for all the right reasons. But it was a look at all of these things that I was covering. I think every incident that you detail in your book, I covered as a journalist for CNN based in Washington. So to see it from the inside of the administration trying to figure out what to do about it, and then you reacting to the media's coverage of it, which I was doing, was extremely valuable. And of course, the subject matter is of vital importance to democracy everywhere, and it affects every person. And just on a personal level, how many here have seen a friend or loved one fall victim to conspiracy theories, who is otherwise a smart person?
Wow, yeah. Look at all those hands.
Quite a few. And how many have inadvertently spread, or maybe not inadvertently, I hope not, spread disinformation, even if it was by clicking or repeating a tweet that you didn't spend enough time to look at? I'm the only one who has. Okay. I will willingly admit it. And how many here have been the subject or the victim, I guess, of disinformation? Wow, okay, that's more people than I would expect. And I remember early in my career, it's a long story, but on the same day that my then news organization, NBC, called out the Bush administration for planting questions in the audience, right-wing groups and organizations and content providers on the internet tried to say that I had fabricated a flood. So it was kind of retaliatory for the mainstream media calling out something that the administration was doing. I don't know how someone would fake or manufacture a flood on national television with millions of viewers. I don't really know how that's possible. But this spread like crazy, facts were ignored. The video was very selectively edited and then sent around. And this was one of the really first times I had been aware of this kind of thing going on. I was the subject of it, and this was 15 years ago. So it was fake news telling me that I was fake news, all rolled together in one big horror story. But in my career, I've covered Russians telling the public that there are no Russian soldiers in Ukraine, to China saying that its vast re-education camps are just for job training and everybody wants to be there, to North Korea saying that its archaeologists have found a real unicorn lair. And kind of wish that one was true, but unfortunately not. But to me personally, the most searing examples, of course, were within the United States. This blatant rebuttal of the overwhelming consensus of the scientific community, of the intelligence community. The horror of this being in the United States, that the United States government would be using phrases now like fake news, attacking the media, when in other areas of the world you could see democracy slowly eroding away by consolidating media, by attacking the free press. Places that were previously shining examples of new democracy, like in Hungary. And here I saw my own government, for the first time really I was covering government, turning these phrases, and I think culminating in 2018, to hear the President of the United States say, just remember, what you are seeing and what you are reading is not what's happening. And then headlines just recently, Democrats warn of heightened disinformation around the debate. Trump falsely echoes the Turks, claiming that SDF Kurds were releasing ISIS fighters, or Trump tries to rewrite reality on his Ukraine controversy. These three headlines were in less than 24 hours this week. 18 hours, those three headlines. So the disinformation, seeing that, like you would expect it from Russia, you expect it from China. I never would have expected that from my own government that I'm trying to cover. And there was a tweet I saw just today, that it was tweeted yesterday. This is not to do with the administration, but I just thought this kind of encapsulated everything. It's from someone who used to work in government in Canada. For the love of God, stop sharing stories from the Buffalo Chronicle. It's a fake news site run by some grifter in the US who's having a good laugh and probably pocketing pretty good ad money too. Think of him as a Buffalo-based Nigerian prince. And then, of course, there's a headline just last night. Trump made 129 false claims last week. And it's my personal belief that if you see this and you're seeing it out there and you're doing nothing about it and you're saying nothing about it, then you're shirking your own responsibility in a democracy that you presumably want to protect before it does become too late, as we see in other places around the world.
Well, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Graham. Really nice to be here. I was hoping my title could be Jolly Good Fellow rather than Distinguished Fellow.
It's up to debate.
Okay. So, and thanks for that great kind of introduction. In fact, government giving disinformation isn't actually a new thing. I remember when I was growing up, the government told me that if I put my head under my desk, I wouldn't be killed in a nuclear holocaust, and that turns out not to have been correct. And the perspective that I come from this at in information wars is, yes, I spent my whole career in media, and when I went into government, I realized, wow, the people in government really don't understand the way media works. And now that I'm in government, I thought, wow, people in media really don't understand the way government works. Mm-hmm. And so the book is a bit of a, it's not disinformation, it's a bit of a deception in the sense that the first chapter is about the kind of global information war and what we're struggling against. The last chapter is what we can do about it. But the meat in the sandwich is a kind of memoir of being in government and fighting two kind of universes of disinformation, ISIS messaging and Russian disinformation. And the narrative actually starts with the annexation of Crimea in February 2014. And even though that wasn't in my bailiwick in government, I saw this incredible array of Russian disinformation and propaganda, and I'd never seen it before, and I'd been in media my whole life. At the same time, I literally did not know what RT was, but I became very well versed in it when they started making fun of me, and I would watch it, have it in my office. But the premise of the book, when it comes to this Russian disinformation, was that basically what Russia did around the annexation of Crimea in 2014, the creation of the Internet Research Agency, which we all know about, became a kind of template or model for what they did here in 2016. The Russians are, as foreign policy people sometimes like to say, are checkers players. They're not chess players. They are opportunistic, and I don't think that they created the Internet Research Agency in 2014 because they knew they were going to come here in 2016 and elect Donald Trump. That is not, that's not real. But what they found, because they use this sort of Edison and the filament model where they just test things, is that, wow, this same stuff that we did in the Baltics and in the Russian periphery, it actually works with those Americans. Even when our grammar and spelling is really bad in English. To use the Nigerian prince model, when I was trying to figure this out, a marketing guy said to me, you get the emails from the Nigerian prince and they're filled with spelling errors and grammatical errors. And I said, yeah. He said, that's deliberate. I said, what do you mean? He said, because that is how they winnow out the audience. If you answer that email, even with the unlikely hypothesis that he's imprisoned, but with the spelling errors and the grammatical errors, they know they have you hooked. That was similar to what the Internet Research Agency did. When I first started getting emails from trolls, I mean, I can't even say these words, but all those 6 words that you can't say on television, they couldn't spell any of them. The grammar was terrible, the spelling was terrible. It's like, who's going to fall for this? Well, you know who's going to fall for it? Lots of Americans. Because, as you were kind of pointing out, as I say in the book, we don't have so much of a fake news problem as we have a media literacy problem. People cannot tell the difference between information that comes from a trusted source and one that doesn't, information that has that's been fact-checked versus information that doesn't, and that is part of the problem. And what's sad ultimately about this whole situation is, I say, it's not just a supply problem, which is a big problem, it's a demand problem. People seek out wrong information and disinformation because they already believe it, and that's part of human nature. And I say in the book, like, we'll have this as long as people lie and other human beings believe that lie, which will be as long as there are human beings. On that sad note, we will start the question.
All right, well, you say it on the front cover. You give it away right there that we lost the global battle. It's not a cliffhanger anymore. But you do detail some successes in there, of course. But one phrase that stands out early on in the book is, we did not see it coming. But then elsewhere you get into all of the examples through recent and longer history of how the Russians did this, how it worked in other countries successfully, the kinds of disinformation. So given the examples, why did all of the resources of the US government, from your standpoint, not see it coming? Because that's a very disturbing sentence.
Yes, so, and in many ways the book tries to answer that question of sort of how did we miss it? And as you say, Michelle, I mean, I spent a lot of time when I was in government reading about and going to seminars on active measures, which is the English term for Russian disinformation going back to the Cold War and even beyond. And we knew all about that. We knew about hybrid warfare. People understood that, but what was hidden in plain sight, to use the great Atlantic Council study that came out in 15 or 16, is actually peculiar to social media. So for example, I'm very complimentary in the book about this company called Facebook that people probably have heard of, Google, YouTube, when it came to countering ISIS messaging. They They didn't get it in the beginning. They hired a lot of Arabic speakers. They started figuring it out. And my first few months, I said, every week I want to have the greatest hits of ISIS disinformation and other disinformation. And so there would be ISIS videos that would be up on YouTube for hours and sometimes days or even weeks. By the time I ended, the ISIS videos on YouTube were taken down in seconds sometimes, often under a minute, at the most a few minutes. They were doing their job. But as someone from Facebook explained to me, this violent content, it's a little bit like pornographic content. The content is the crime. We can take it down. It violates our terms of service, which are their constitutions, which we'll talk about. The problem with the Russian stuff is that because of the nature of the internet, because of anonymity, it pretended to be something else, and we got fooled like everybody else. So I don't know that there was anybody in the US government, at least until the very end, that understood, for example, that Tennessee GOP was not a group of Republican women in Tennessee, but a bunch of people at the Internet Research Agency in St. Petersburg. We saw the stuff that the IRA was doing around Crimea. Nobody thought they would do it here. We've always thought we were sort of immune, and we mostly missed it. And I actually say, that we should have been, before the election in 2016, had a kind of a whole of government effort to do something about it, and even the White House should have said this is a direct attack on the very foundation of our democracy, and Americans need to be aware of it.
I think some of the best passages of the book deal with the vast bureaucracy that is the State Department, and I found them, hilarious in a kind of sad way of you trying to get past all of the red tape. You saw good ideas die a horrible death. You saw lots of meetings, sometimes for meetings' sake, but no planning meetings. You described the ethos as passive and risk averse, and I think one of the best phrases that you use to describe the State Department and trying to get things done is aggressive passivity. I think it just kind of hits you right there. You feel the bureaucracy around you. So do you think that is the cause of missing these influences? And even though you yourself tried to work against it, now, do you feel like there was more that you should have or could have done to just shake the top of the tree, which was the secretary and then the president, and say, this is not working, and here's why. Here's part of the process that we need to eliminate?
Before I answer that question, are there any Foreign Service officers here? Hi. Any ex-Foreign Service officers? I love being in the State Department. Mm-hmm. I love being in government. But I found the bureaucracy frustrating. And one of the stories I tell in the book is there was this entity underneath me called the Center for Strategic Counterterrorism Communications. Government is also very bad at naming things. CSCC. Took me like 6 months to be able to say it. And CSCC was created by Secretary Hillary Clinton to combat a revolutionary media terrorist organization called Al-Qaeda, because they put a guy on a hillside who spoke directly to camera and then loaded it up to YouTube. But CSCC, to its credit, saw the rise of ISIS, and they started to try to branch out. And early on in my tenure, the head of CSCC came to me and said, this is when the 200 girls from Chibok, Nigeria were kidnapped, and he said, look, we want to do a banner about bring back our girls and put it up right away. It's right in the news. And I said, great. And they showed it to me, and I'd spent the last 10 years looking at graphics and layouts and pictures. I mean, it was awful. But I said, it has to go up. So I approved it and didn't think anything about it. 10 days later, the head of CSCC came to me and said, I have a problem I need you to solve. And I said, what is it? He said, well, that banner about the girl, bring back our girls, it hasn't gotten through the clearance process. 10 days later, I mean, in the internet, right, 20 minutes might be too late. And because originally the Africa Bureau didn't approve it, and they changed it to satisfy the Africa Bureau, and then the Refugees Bureau didn't approve it, and then they changed it, and then Business Bureau didn't approve it. And to me, it was a perfect example of how the clearance process can actually eliminate bad things, but it ends up eliminating good things. And part of the idea when I came from the private sector is it's not like things weren't vetted or there wasn't a kind of a clearance process at time. Things got edited twice and they were copy edited. But there was a feeling like we need to get it out there for it to have some purchase and some effect in the world. And if there's one theme when it comes to this about the State Department, which as I say I love, that if a Democrat is elected in 2020, if we simply go back to the status quo and the way we did things, I really think that would be a mistake. Yes, it would be miles better than we're doing now, but it can be so much better. And I actually believed in a more active government. I mean, when I was in government, I used to tell my conservative friends, well, you should be in favor of big government because big government gets nothing done. I'm much more in favor of a more nimble kind of government that can be more proactive about things. And I think the people at the State Department probably feel the same way too, and are frustrated by that process.
So did you coin the hashtag Bring Back Our Girls? Was that you?
No.
You were, or
No.
you were co-opting it from.
By the way, Michelle Obama had already tweeted it before.
Yeah. Okay. So she
it's
came
not like
first.
we were out ahead of anything.
I was just about to say, as soon as Michelle Obama posed with that sign,
Yes.
it just seemed to go
Yes.
everywhere.
You'd think it would get approved after that. But.
So, which brings us to the subject of the messenger. That's a big struggle throughout your description of trying to counter the messages that were everywhere from ISIS and from Russia. And counter is another difficult term, because what is counter messaging? What should it be? And I feel like most importantly, what you learned was it really depends on who that message comes from. And that might sound obvious, but when you're trying to do something from within government, I guess you do what you can. But you have this one sentence, and you were quoting somebody else who had written this in the counter messaging. And this person said in a memo, I think it was, states' messages arrived with all the grace of someone's dad showing up at a college party. So it truly depends on who the voice is that's countering the popular messaging. And it seems like you and your teams really hit on third-party voices.
Yes.
But it's still difficult to define really what counter messaging should be. Does it depend on the situation, or how would you encapsulate what you learned about that really tough question?
Well, just like any author will remember, even the slightest negative thing in any review, that quote came from a piece that was about CSCC and criticizing it. And actually, the phrase, and I give credit here, we were in the Situation Room discussing counter ISIS messaging, and at one point in the meeting, Ben Rhodes, who was in the meeting, looked around the room and he said, maybe we're not the best messengers for this message. And I looked around, it was like a bunch of white guys in suits. And in fact, I came to the conclusion that government in many ways is the worst messenger for the often very good message that we want out there, because the bad guys, their whole theme is that government can't be trusted. The US government can't be trusted. Whether it's ISIS or Putin, the US government is the source of all evil. So if I said jokingly, like, you think a tweet from the Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy to a young man who's thinking of going to fight in Syria is going to be effective? Obviously not. And the other anomaly about government was that the word counter. I mean, I found that in government, if there was something that you were against and something was happening that was wrong, if you just put the word counter in front of it, you'd think you were doing something about it, like, counterterrorism, counter-violence, the counter-Russian disinformation group, which we started. But that also, it shows this kind of bias that we have, which is that if you don't like something being done to you, you try to do the same thing back. And as it turns out, that also isn't such a good idea. And that's one of the things that the Russians and even ISIS liked, is that they were incredibly chuffed when we attacked ISIS. The Russians loved it when we attacked them. It's like the Mark Twain line of, like, you don't get in an argument with a pig because you just get dirty and he likes it. That is exactly, how it works. So I became much less sanguine about what government could do. And as you say, we basically realized one of the things we could do is we could support people who were doing this already, who had more credibility than we had, who did it better. And that is one thing that government could do. And not to give away the mystery, I mean, the creation of the Global Engagement Center at the end of the book and the end of this process, part of that idea of that was to help support really good messengers out there who have a message that we supported.
Right, and to get it funded to $80 million,
Yes,
sorry. Because as you detail in the book, at the height of the ISIS propaganda, they were putting out about 50,000 pieces of information a day, whereas the US government across its entirety was putting out 350 a day. So what do you think that the government now, if anything, is doing well in combating this kind of disinformation?
Well, when it came to ISIS, I know this sounds sort of facile, but I remember talking to a general. Actually, one of the things that he said to me was that, now I'm blanking on that. He said, I know we were in a panel like this on stage, and somebody else was talking, and he said, I know how to defeat ISIS. So I said, how? And he leaned over to me and he said, get them involved in the interagency process. But one of the things that that I did see, and this is kind of a unpleasant point I'm about to make, is that, as I said to the guys in the military and in the White House, when ISIS takes a city, that's the worst message for us of all. And when we take a city from ISIS, that's the best message for us. And so the actual, and I know this is coming to the news lately with what's happened in Syria, the methodical way that the Obama administration assembled the international coalition against ISIS, which reached 80 nations, and it was slow, that actually was the thing that defeated them, even in the content realm, because they defeated them on the ground. There just weren't any digital jihadis anymore on the ground after the military operation. That actually decreases creation of content. So, but we weren't a good messenger about them. And I actually do think one of the things that John Allen, who's a character in the book, said, and he helped create this coalition, and he also helped create the military coalition, is that the problem with ISIS is that they're an idea as much as they are a state, and they never were really a very good state. And in fact, the fact that they wanted to create a state called the Caliphate, we're good at defeating states. We're not good at defeating non-state actors. And what's, I think, dangerous about this circumstance now is not so much that these ISIS guys will escape and create a state again, but they will escape and create a kind of a digital realm where they're appealing.
Yeah. Now, you tell this great story where you're testifying before House Foreign Affairs, and the chairman comes out and talks about how we're losing the information war and it's going so poorly and what losers we are and we can't fight these guys. And you say, wait a second, and you detail that there's now 6 times more anti-ISIS content circulating around than there is pro, and when you started it was about 1 to 1. And that ISIS content was at that point 0.0124% of Twitter. And as you described it, mainstream Muslims were winning. And I remember watching this very hearing, and we were all saying, well, is this spin? Like, wait, what, is this real? Like, is he spinning this? Like, so because we always had our radar up for spin, and they're trying to paint this as they're doing well, but it reminded everyone, because you had the statistics to back it up, it reminded both the chairman of the committee as well as the media watching that we're so stuck in this way of seeing things because the controversial images and the terrifying images are what stay inside of you, that you forget to check up and see, well, how much content really is there? And I thought that was a very eye-opening point.
Well, during that time, seems like a happier time than today, but during that
when
time
we looked out for, we were worried about spin instead of outright lies.
Yes, from the disinformationist in chief, as I call him in the book. But I used to say to audiences, I said, what percentage of the content that ISIS does do you think is in English? And I won't ask you here, and probably some people know the answer, but people say they didn't know. And I said, that 84% of the content they do is in Arabic. They do more in Russian and French than in English. Americans are narcissistic in the sense that we think everybody is creating stuff for us. And they did create stuff for us to scare us. That's what terrorism is about. And we were very effectively scared.
Yes, absolutely.
And to spin it into what happened in 2016, I would argue in part that's why the Russians were successful too. We're incredibly gullible. As sophisticated as we are, we created these platforms. People are not good at distinguishing fact from fiction, and because of confirmation bias, they seek out information that they already agree with. That's part of the problem of disinformation, that it's a demand problem, it's not just a supply problem. And not to get too far ahead of myself, but I talk a little bit about things that we can do. But at the end of the day, we're all individually responsible. That's partially what a democracy is. So I'm sure we'll get to that, particularly now that I see the universal Q&A sign.
I'm sure people have lots of questions, so let's go for it. How about you?
Hi, my name is Krishna. Thanks for being here. I wanted to ask what your thoughts were on the private sector in the disinformation fight. Given in the private sector, there's a clear established framework of digital influence and psychological marketing to target consumers based on their clicks and likes, or what they don't click and what they don't like. It seems kind of the techniques are common, whether it's Russian actors or a company trying to induce consumers to buy something. So what's the private sector strategy? Because it seems awfully similar.
Very good question. And one of the things I say in the end is that the same micro-targeting techniques that Nike uses to sell you sneakers, the Internet Research Agency used to sell you Trump or sell you anti-Hillary content. One of the things that I write about in the book that I'm skeptical about in terms of how the marketplace works is the transfer from advertising and marketing linked to brands, where you would buy an ad in Time magazine, versus programmatic advertising where people buy ads to reach audiences. So for example, if you're trying to sell sneakers to somebody, you're looking for like young men between 18 and 24. You're buying that audience, you're not buying Sports Illustrated. And no human being comes into the equation when you're buying targeted or programmatic advertising. But young men who buy sneakers also look at a lot of other nasty stuff, from conspiracies to pornography or whatever. So it's like, surprise, surprise, when there's a Nike ad that turns up on one of these sites. Well, that's because that's the way the system works. And so there have been some, there's some legislative proposals which I think are good and which a lot of people agree with. I mean, the Honest Ads Act, for example, which is still not approved, but one of the things that does is that that advertising, particularly political advertising, needs to be transparent. You need to know who bought it. You need to know why you've been targeted. You need to know what the programmatic information that they actually know about you because you got this particular ad. That would help. Other things that would help is the provenance of information, whether it comes from a foreign country or domestic, whether it's a human being or a bot. All of these things the platform companies can help with, and I think they know that they need to, and I think it's a shame, obviously, that Congress hasn't been able to enact these legislative potential solutions. And the larger one is amending the Communications and Decency Act, Section 230, which folks know about. Hope there are public policy people here in the audience. But that legislation basically gave the platform companies immunity from any kind of liability for the content that they publish, because they weren't publishers. Well, they're the biggest publishers in the history of civilization. They cannot have the same liability that Time Magazine or CNN has for the content they publish, because we're curating it. But they need to have some liability for third-party creators who are practicing hate speech, who are creating verifiably false information, deep fakes, all of those things they need to have liability for so they can take them off. So that's what I propose in the book.
Any other questions out there?
Hi there, thank you for being here. I'm
Hi.
Allie Smith at the College of Information and Cyber at National Defense University. So what you said about kind of where we're going kind of as a whole nation approach to what do we do about it, there's a lot of sentiment about this should happen, that should happen, but not a whole lot of action or execution. So I'm just curious about your kind of spin or thoughts, and I'm sorry I haven't read your book yet, but your kind of spin and thoughts about kind of beyond whole nation approach, where we are a democracy, nonprofit sort of organizations who are trained appropriately to counter disinformation, misinformation, grassroots organizations, away from the government's going to do this or the education department's going to do that, and just kind of, I guess, scoping out like maybe the next 20 years what that might look like. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, I did mention earlier media literacy. That needs to be taught in schools. Civics. You know, I mentioned the National Constitution Center. I remember Sandra Day O'Connor said to me way back then, she was on the board, we're going to pay a terrible price for having stopped teaching civics in America 40 years ago. And we have paid a terrible price. I mean, I do think there are things that could be done when it comes to media literacy. You know, I have two sons who are in college now, and they've got, you know, a fancy private school education in Manhattan. And one of the things they were telling me is that they're in college, and it's like all these kids come in and they don't know what a footnote is. They don't know the difference between a primary source and a secondary source. They don't know what a bibliography is. Well, in the academic world, that is how we tell information that's different, you know, between what's a trusted source and what's not, what's fact and what's fiction. So I do think that's a long-term solution. You know, the other thing that's unpopular that I discovered was I'd been a magazine editor and a journalist my whole life. I was about as close to being a First Amendment absolutist as it was possible to be, that the First Amendment wasn't just to protect the speech that we like, as the Justice famously said, but the speech that we hate. Well, that's an incredible outlier around the world. I don't know that anybody, even Western Europeans, don't get the American First Amendment. And I mean, I had traveled all around the Middle East, and you know, foreign ministers would say to me, "Why do you allow that wacky minister in Florida to burn a Koran?" Well, First Amendment. Well, they don't get that, and neither do a lot of other Muslims around the world. And so the thing that I actually think, and this is sort of unpopular, is that I think the U.S. should have some similar statutes to hate speech statutes in Europe, not as strict. And remember, the First Amendment doesn't apply to Facebook and Google and Twitter. What are the first 5 words of the First Amendment? Congress shall make no law. It's about preventing the government from censoring information. It's not about preventing Facebook from censoring information. Why shouldn't Facebook take off hate speech, dangerous speech, speech that leads to violence? I mean, that's up to them. And so I do think, going back to your question, I mean, regulations that incentivize them to do that, I think, are a good thing.
Yeah, I was very surprised in that chapter of what should be done to see your advocacy for more government regulation. I almost dropped my book at that point. But when you read your ideas, it's mild and it's logical.
Well, the thing is, you know, not to get too far in the weeds, but when I started researching it, that Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, it was actually, if you think about it in the context of the time, it was wise legislation. The idea was, hey, we see these new companies being born that use not professional content, but third-party content, user-generated content. How do we incentivize them to have more of that? Well, we tell them that they're not editors, so they don't have to edit it, and that will create more content. Well, it did. But, and I didn't go to law school, and maybe there's a legal term for it, but a law that incentivizes something to the point where there's too much of it, you have to change the law. So that's my feeling. And again, it's not so much that I want more government regulation in general, but government regulation is the sort of red lines between which people can operate.
Absolutely.
And that needs to change.
I mean, for example, with Facebook and other platforms like that, you advocate for making sure that they make a good faith effort to monitor this. So I think that's one example of a reasonable addition to the law. But it seemed like you were saying, in the case of Charlie Hebdo and the attacks that came after the magazine published the picture of Muhammad that was so inflammatory, you seem to be advocating for putting that on the cover being maybe illegal.
Well, yeah.
And I was very surprised by this.
Yeah. So I know it'll be a little unpopular, but so the Supreme Court case that is the model of modern free speech law is not the famous "you can't yell fire in a crowded theater," but Brandenburg versus Ohio, which basically said the only speech that's not protected, as opposed to some speeches, which is, that's not, is speech which directly leads to violence. I thought, okay, that's a reasonable standard. So these guys at Charlie Hebdo had put Muhammad on the cover twice before, one time causing violence all around the Muslim world where hundreds of people were killed.
Yeah, but
do you think when they put Muhammad on the cover a third time that's going to be speech that directly leads to violence?
But that's just bowing to the ridiculous reality that a picture would incite violence. Someone has to fight against.
Is 1.6 billion Muslims the ridiculous reality of people who are offended by something that they don't understand it?
There's the debate.
Yeah. So, I mean, I cut some of it from the book, but I highly recommend Gary Trudeau, who is the famous cartoonist who created Doonesbury, had a commencement speech where he talked about Charlie Hebdo, and it has a lovely line which is, just because you can insult someone doesn't mean that you should, and maybe the standard should be, is anybody really laughing at this? It's really worth reading.
Good point. Any other questions? Yep.
Thanks. At a Council on Foreign Relations panel last year, you said, "I'm not against propaganda. Every country does it, and they have to do it to their own population." You went on to describe your role at the State Department as the chief propagandist. So since this event is billed as your explanation of how disinformation is a threat to democracy, at what point did you change your mind? Is it only disinformation when done by a perceived threat to American military or economic hegemony? And is it fair to characterize this event as an expression of American or NATO propaganda?
So thank you for that question, because I'd love to clear this up a little bit, because I was dinged by that. I always forget that there's a camera on. And by the way, I did an event at the council the other day where I essentially said the same thing. I never said that I was propagandist in chief. I was described by other people as being propagandist in chief. And I make a distinction between disinformation, misinformation, and propaganda. Disinformation is false information deliberately created to deceive you about a point of view. Misinformation is something that's mistaken. That's something we all do, and as a journalist, we often make mistakes. Propaganda is something in between. The word comes from propagare, the propagation of the faith, from about the Catholic Church in the 16th century. It's a word where it's about the use of rhetoric to persuade people of a certain point of view. It can be good or it can be bad. I don't have an automatic definition where I say all propaganda is bad. We did a lot of propaganda during World War II. Why We Fight by Frank Capra. That's good propaganda. I'm sorry? I'm not saying that. So I think this Dude, let me finish. That's not propaganda. This idea that it comes from people, I think, who just hear the word propaganda and they see red about it. So, and I know all these people, it's going to happen again, and you're taping that, but that's the explanation.
Okay, we have one more question, yeah?
Let all your folks buy a copy of the book, okay? That would make it worthwhile.
Hello, my name is Taya from the Heritage Foundation, and I recently read a report from the Vietnam Veterans of America warning Vietnam veterans and veterans in America about how foreign trolls are targeting them because they're thought influencers. And as we approach the 2020 elections, I'm wondering if you can clarify how tactics might change in regards to foreign intervention and false information. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. I actually wasn't aware of that about the veterans, and in the recent Senate Intelligence Committee report that came out this past week, there was a really interesting section about new things that are happening for 2020. A lot of people are aware of, deep fakes, which I think is a serious problem. And I'm trying to think of, is there a positive example of a deep fake? I mean, should they be automatically taken down? But one of the things they mentioned was also new to me, whereby, yes, the Russian trolls, as I talk about in the book, and the manual tells them to do that, you figure out 5 or 6 different personas, pretend to be an American here in Florida or wherever. But one of the things the report mentioned, which I hadn't seen before, is this idea of bad actors like Russians or Iranians or whomever renting Facebook names from actual Americans or Twitter handles. That would be an interesting thing. There would be absolutely no way to really discover that. One of the reasons that the Russian trolls were found was that they found records of buying space on American servers. They, the Internet Protocol was traced back to them. If you did that, if you used actual American handles of actual American people, I think some might actually rent them out or sell them. It would be very hard to discover that. So I think the suborning of Americans to participate in disinformation is something which is dangerous. And I think also, people are looking at what happened in 2016, and the biggest and most rising part of disinformation is domestic disinformation, conspiracy theories, extremist groups, all of that. I mean, the template is there.
Oh, stay off that internet. So this is a lightning round. Feel free to answer as briefly as you would like, even yes or no.
By the way, speaking of the internet, I remember I did tell a story about a congresswoman who said to me when I went to see her about how do we get some legislation for anti-ISIS content and more money, and she said, can't we just close off that part of the internet? And by the way, you saw Congress's expertise in this when Mark Zuckerberg was a witness.
Okay, so at one point you say in your book, truth is, I don't know that what we did made any difference. Do you still feel that way? Really?
Yes.
Okay. Someone in Latvia told you, we can't fight propaganda with propaganda because then we become what we are fighting. You believe that?
I agree with that. And also, I mean, one of the things about going to the Baltics that was bracing, we're Americans, right? People around the world think of us as naive, and they'd say, look, we've had Russia on our border for 1,000 years. I mean, we've been the recipient of invasions, not just disinformation. You guys are coming really late to this party, and it's true. I think that's one reason why we didn't see it, and why people might have been more aware of it beforehand. I mean, Latvia was the source of Russian disinformation years before. All of the Baltics have been on the receiving end of that. They have a skepticism and an awareness that we didn't have, because at the end of the day, I think I felt this, and people in government felt it, that we were somehow immune, that it couldn't happen here, and that's one reason that we didn't see it.
Is putting out large amounts of content to promote American values propaganda, in your view?
I came to the conclusion that the best message for America is the content and the stuff that we created ourselves. And that, in the Joe Nye phrase, American soft power was what won the Cold War. And you know who else thought that? Vladimir Putin. And when Putin came into office, remember the first thing he did was take over the television stations. They started creating more content. Soft power is very, very powerful. And I think our own media that's critical, that engages in debate and argument, in many ways is the best platform for what America is, when people see that, rather than stuff that the government creates that could be termed propaganda, because people think they question it because it comes from government.
Would you call Fox News propaganda?
Well, I guess the question is it good propaganda or bad propaganda? I think it's information that comes from a particular point of view and sees everything through a particular narrative, and it's not always a healthy one.
Is MSNBC propaganda?
I also think MSNBC comes from a particular point of view, but I think it's a healthier one.
And one of the big debates was with encryption and people using encrypted apps. U.S. law enforcement wanted at least a backdoor to access them. And you very tactfully in your book don't take a stand on that. What's your view on that?
Well, part of it is that I tell the story of this meeting that was reported in the press where the White House and a few other people went and met with all the leaders of Silicon Valley. And a fellow named James Comey was at the meeting, who told a story about how they spent months and months cracking a terrorist case using every kind of technique in the book. But if Apple had just been able to unlock a phone, they would have solved it overnight. And then I quote Tim Cook's response to that, which is, "Hey, the horse has left the barn on encryption. We're living in an encrypted world. Things are only going to get more encrypted. How can you combat terrorism, combat crime in a world where encryption is given?" And I think the point is that it's never going to be reversed. You can't put the genie back in the bottle on that. And it does create problems for law enforcement. At the same time, I also get the privacy issue. Throughout our history, privacy and national security have been on opposite ends of the spectrum. And so I also don't like the idea of giving up privacy. What was the Ben Franklin line? For every little ounce we give up of privacy for national security, we betray ourselves. So I am mixed about it, but I think it doesn't matter anymore because encryption is the way of the world.
Okay, so last question. It's so difficult to pin down what works and what works when the timing is right. What does success in countering disinformation at this point in time look like? And is there any evidence that people are becoming more savvy to disinformation because we're all talking about it so much?
Just to answer the last part first, yes, I think it's a good thing that we talk about it and people are more aware of it. One of the paradoxes of combating disinformation is, I think the phrase was coined by a researcher named Emily Thorson, and it's called belief echoes. And it's this idea that we, in this marketplace of ideas model that we have of the First Amendment, which I say is actually not working anymore, part of that idea is this idea that truth will drive out falsehood. John Stuart Mill never said exactly how truth does drive out falsehood, but we've always sort of believed that that's why we protect both. But Professor Thorson has this idea of belief echoes, is that even if you take a piece of false content and you publish it in order to rebut it with saying that it's wrong and here's the true content, it creates a belief echo in your head that never gets obliterated. From a kind of tendentious standpoint, I would say, let's not repeat the president's wrong tweet in order to rebut it. Let's just say what the reality is. But the problem with the news organizations is, well, we can't just come at something to say this is the reality. We have to explain why we're doing this story. So I think part of the difficulty is that we're living in this world where fact and fiction gets mashed up, and it gets mashed up even in our own brains. It's hard to figure that out.
So if you had carte blanche when you walked into the State Department, any amount of money to combat disinformation and no red tape, what's the first thing you would have done? Would it be to start the equivalent of the Internet Research Agency, or that would have been fighting propaganda with propaganda? What would you have? What would have been?
Yes, at the end of the day, I don't believe in fighting propaganda with propaganda. I don't think we should become the thing that we oppose. At the end of the day, I thought the best role that we could play at the State Department is supporting people who are creating content that we think would be valuable to be out there, and sometimes that was counter disinformation. Sometimes it was just content that showed democracy in action. I think the well is poison when government creates that content. So I thought that the government as a kind of incubator of positive and good content was the best role that we could play.
Thank you so much for
Thank
being
you.
here. Great job.
Okay.